Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Center Goa. We have with us Dr. Shamika Ravi, who is not a first-time visitor to the International Center. She has been here earlier. Perhaps at that time, many of you did not live in Goa, or some of you did. But at that time, she was with Brookings Institution, and she is now currently with the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. And she is also a secretary with the Government of India. It's a great pleasure to have you again with us, Shamika. So, and on a topic which I think really needs to be discussed more often. Very quickly, just a couple of things. We keep seeing the term demographic dividend in the newspapers all too often, but we do not see the term gender dividend as often as we should. And part of the India story, Viksit Bharat 2047, has got to be, the realization of this gender dividend. In fact, over the last 10 years, what we have seen is a decline in women's participation in the workforce, and now it's rising again. And Shamika has done excellent work on that, and that's why I thought it would be a great idea to have her here with us. Other than the fact that, it gave us an opportunity to bring her to ICG once again. So with that quick introduction, and I'm not going to say anything more about you already have received emails about what she does, what are the research areas she works on, and we'll begin straight away. The talk will be for about 40 minutes. After that, we may have about up to about 30 minutes of Q&A, which I'll moderate. So keep your questions short at that time. And to begin with, please switch off your cell phones. Please check your cell phones and switch them off. Thank you. Shamika?
Thank you,
Light again.
It's always wonderful to be out of Delhi. It's unbearable right now. The 47 degrees gave way to such high levels of humidity. I'm basically a researcher. I've been a professor all my life. Within the EAC, before I formally start the lecture, let me give you a sense of what the EAC does. The EAC is really like it's a research body, think tank for the PM and the PMO. It's not the Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog works with different states, and it works with the ministry. So it works with the government. Our job is to really go over beyond sometimes, and most times it's troubleshooting, which is why I think half of what we write comes out into the open. Half of what we write is really troubleshooting within. So the nature of academic research that the country right now needs. I'm here to impress upon you that for a large, complex economy like ours, dynamic, which is growing so fast, we really need real-time economic intelligence. And the reason I say economic, not just financial, is because the financial sector is one part of the economy. There's so much more to the economy. If you look at labor markets, the agriculture, gender becomes a huge issue, health and education, the fact that we are a federal structure and every state must have their own, its own economic strategy to feed into the larger Viksit Bharat 2047 vision, means that we really need a lot of research. We need a lot of real-time economic intelligence, which must feed into policy making. I'm going to present to you a sliver of what that research has been in the last 5-6 years. We can take questions towards the end, but what I do want to impress upon you, there are going to be different stories, because I'm going to present close to 10 papers today. Okay, each of them is a published peer-reviewed paper, which if you're interested in any of them, I do encourage you to download it and read the paper. If you have any thoughts, do write in to me. I'll be very happy to engage. So maybe I'll take it from there now. Yeah, so I do have a presentation, largely because I'm an empiricist, I'm an applied microeconomist, which means I take data, high frequency data, and I try and test different theories, okay? So a lot of it will be pictures. This is something that you're all familiar with. This is India's growth story. This is per capita income, by the way. It's a remarkable story because there are very few countries which have managed to achieve this kind of exponential growth. The thing to bear in mind is, if I ask you, when did India's exponential growth story begin? The reflex answer will be 1991, because that is when we began to liberalize. But what you really notice here is the point of inflection, meaning when does the rate or the trend break? The trend does not break in 1991. The trend really breaks around 2000, which goes to show that, you can change rules. Many things can be made simple, which were, because fundamentally we started dismantling the license permit Raj, which we inherited. The rules by themselves are important. But what is equally important perhaps is active investment from the government into basic infrastructure, connectivity, core sectors of the economy, which impact growth directly. So it's only in the late 1990s that we had major structural reforms, like we went from being power deficient to becoming a power surplus economy. Our connectivity in terms of the spectrum, not just the sales, which entered the larger political and news media cycles, but the fact that India received, it was almost like a communication revolution, where connectivity through cell phone just expanded like fire. The golden quadrilateral, if you consider the big infrastructure in terms of roads, airlines got privatized. These are very core sectors of the economy. And when government actively begins to do capital expenditure in core sectors of the economy, it has a crowding in impact. It has a very positive reinforcement, and it pulls up overall productivity in the economy. Private investments also rise. You will see overall growth happen. So that's the simple growth story. Another thing to bear in mind, this is the only major economy in the world where almost all predictions and forecasts of growth have been only revised in one direction. Every time there's a forecast, the revisions are almost always upwards. And that just tells you that we are in many ways going beyond our own expectations. Now, it could be that we are conservative in our own forecast. We like to be a little sure, we like to be, we don't want to boast, we want to be very certain. But this is a very tried and tested theme when it comes to forecast of India's growth. They have almost always, IMF forecast, OECD forecast, World Bank forecast, they have all been revised upwards, particularly if you look at it post-pandemic. But economic growth by itself is not the story. The great Indian story which is developing right now is one of what does that economic growth translate into. And what you have noticed in the last 12 years is an unprecedented decline in poverty rate. So this is a EPW which is coming out, I think, next week. But you have a sort of a first sight of this. This is using the National Sample Survey data, which looks at household consumption expenditure. Poverty is measured in terms of how much does a household spend. Income data is very noisy. Income is of many different from sources. It's always noisy. Traditionally, we have measured poverty in terms of expenditure, consumption expenditure. What do we notice? That not just the Tendulkar line, you're all familiar, or at least you've heard of it. The Tendulkar poverty line was based on food. That how many, if an adult person had to consume 2,500 calories, what is the amount of money that had to be spent? But Tendulkar poverty line, therefore, is an extreme, it's like a destitution, that you're not dying of hunger, death, that level of poverty. That's why the Rangarajan poverty line is superior to that, because it's a bit moderate. It includes food, but it also includes conveyance, rental, health, education, the kind of things that must ideally enter the basic consumption basket for a person to have a decent, minimum decent quality of life. And this is the Rangarajan poverty line that I'm showing you. And this is not at the state level, it is at the NSS region level. NSS region is like commissionerate. You know, we have clusters of districts which are like commissionerates. All right? That is what this region here is. And what do you see? On an average, India's poverty rate as per Tendulkar poverty was 29.5 in the year 11-12, which meant nearly 30% Indians were below poverty line 12 years back. Today that number is 3.9%. This is nothing short of historical, because we have all grown up on Garibi Hatao. And India has finally achieved this SDG 1, which is reduction of extreme poverty below 3%. All right. Do you also see that this is not driven by 1 or 2 states? This is not driven by 1 or 2 or 10 cities. It's an all India story. It's happening everywhere, which tells you just how widespread the improvements in terms of poverty eradication are. So this is one of the biggest stories that is unfolding today. We want to look a little beyond, because we are an open, free, plural democracy. We do care about what about different social groups and religious groups, right, beyond the geographies. And what do you notice? That poverty rate for Muslim households used to be 32% 12 years back. Today it's down to 2.4%. If you look at Hindu households, it used to be around 31%. Today it is 4%. Overall, of course, it is what I told you. Urban and rural. In fact, urban Muslim households used to be some of the poorest in India, close to 40% poverty rate. That number is down to 5.7. So it is not this geographically widespread improvements in terms of poverty reduction, but also across different religious groups, also different social groups. If you look at scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, in fact, scheduled tribe, 50% poverty rate in rural areas 12 years back. That number is down to 12%. Right? If you look at urban areas, again, same story. I don't want to keep repeating. The idea is that reduction in poverty in India has been universal in nature. Right? And that is exactly what democratic institutions are meant to achieve. Why do I say democratic institutions? You know, there are fast-moving countries in the world. For instance, China, right, or Vietnam. None of these countries have this level of breakup across social or regions in terms of rural-urban. This kind of scrutiny happens here on account of the fact that no election in India can be won without talking about development. Now, it's a different issue. You can say whether the delivery of that happens or not, but development is always on the agenda of all elections, not just the central elections or the state, but also local level. Right? Development is an agenda. Development must be an agenda for a nation like ours. And on this metric of poverty reduction, we seem to have made widespread improvement. Here is another sustainable development goal. I'll focus on a few of them. So SDG 1 was poverty eradication. Maternal mortality rate. And why am I focusing on SDGs? Because we are signatories. We have signed, which means that we have pledged to achieve these targets for ourselves. Maternal mortality tells you the number of women who die during childbirth. This graph compares the reduction in maternal mortality at the global level, those are the orange bars, and the reduction of maternal mortality for India, those are the blue bars. Do you see the difference? India is reducing maternal mortality more than twice as fast as the global average. A lot of it is fueled by the fact that we have resources today. We do have money to spend, governments have money to spend, but it's not just the money. In fact, if you look at data more closely, several problems are no longer all India problems. Maternal mortality rate, for instance, is a problem of 6 or 7 states of India. It's not an all India problem. Similarly, if you look at infant mortality, etc. In fact, 10 states of India have already achieved most of these SDGs. It gives you a sense of how vast, how diverse India's growth and development story is. This is infant mortality rate. On the x-axis, so at the bottom you are seeing, with increase in per capita income, what is happening to infant mortality rate. And do you see that all these balls are dropping? Whether these are the poorest states, the southern states, or the others, it tells you the speed with which infant mortality rate is falling across the country with economic growth in those states. Some of the biggest improvements are also happening in some of the biggest. Look at the size of the ball indicates the size of the population. UP, MP, look at Odisha, absolute rock star when it comes to achieving some of these targets. Kerala has been at the bottom for some time because they have very good numbers. They already achieved infant mortality rate numbers are very low, nearly 30 years back. But look at the rest. This is what economic growth eventually is about. It fuels improvements in quality of life. And we're just measuring it through different ways. Here is one other metric. You know, when you pick up a lot of newspapers which are looking in from the outside, one narrative that we have had to read in the last several years is that India is getting very intolerant, India is getting more violent. Now, as economists, for us, you know, one anecdote can always be pulverized by another anecdote. I can say things are terrible, and then you say, no, things are very good. So my lived experiences versus your lived experience, where is reality? That's why we believe so much in data. Data is not the all truth. Data is trying to get to the truth. But at least when you see it in large numbers and you see long-term trends, it gives you faith that there is something, this is objectively as truthful as we can possibly get in a society which is so diverse and large. These are the number of riots in India. Why am I studying riots? Because riots, the definition has not changed in the last 60 years. What is a riot? A riot is a violent episode which involves 5 or more people for a common purpose. It gets registered in the local police station. To the elders in the room, you knew just how many riots India used to have until 1990. In fact, the number tells you it was over 110 lakh, right? It's 110, so 1,10,000. That's the kind of rioting India used to have every year. Today, that number is, in fact, this is latest for 2021, it is close to 40,000. Now, of course, 40,000 is also too many riots, but you're talking about 1.47 billion people. Looking at the trend, what you notice is there is a structural break. Riots continue to rise. In fact, the decline only began when India's economic growth started. And as economists, the literature will tell you this is something called the opportunity cost of violence is rising. It's not that our policing has become particularly better or that we have started to spend particularly more on riot control. Yes, technology is allowing for many things to happen, but the structural break is on account of the fact that opportunity cost of violence has risen. People's tolerance in the street for this kind of violence is low now. People resist this. Okay? That is what you have more to lose now as an ordinary citizen. And that is what opportunity cost of violence. So India today is far more peaceful than it has been in the last 50 years. So when you read a lived experience of an individual who's traveling or touring in India, that is not the objective reality of India. This is the objective reality of India. What about crime against women? And these are rapes, again, because the definition has not changed. These are all the states of the country. All right? What you notice is, not everywhere, because there are 3 states, Haryana, Rajasthan, and Jharkhand, where the trend has not reversed. It continues to grow. But everywhere else, over the last 20 years, whether it is a BJP government, a Congress government, pick your party of choice, there has been a reversal in trend around 16, 17. State after state, around that 3-4 year duration. What exactly has happened? And there is a phenomenal paper in Lancet, it links it to the building of 120 million toilets in rural India. Because when we built the toilets, and I included, when we wrote about going open defecation free, we tried to articulate and make a compelling argument based on health metrics. That, you know, when you have very high levels of open defecation, we had 40%, by the way. Next to India was France at 20%. But 40% open defecation is very high. And the arguments we would make is that the fecal matter finds its way into the water. So waterborne diseases, high neonatal deaths, all kinds of infection deaths, diarrheal deaths. So open defecation is an anathema, we must get rid of it. But almost all measures of outcome that we were pushing were from the health, public health perspective. The impact, however, while we have had, almost all studies have shown remarkable improvements in NMR, MMR, infectious diseases, etc., crime against women. The fact that rapes reduced by 17% or 14% and assault reduced by close to 24%, it tells you just how gendered toilets, access to toilets are. That's because women in secluded areas, particularly because that's when they would go out to defecate, early mornings, late evenings, dark, secluded, that's when they're particularly vulnerable. That's when a lot of these episodes would happen. So the building of toilets have had an impact way beyond just health. It's fundamentally quality of life for women and girls, particularly in rural India, everywhere, state after state. Now we are trying to, beyond certain, social and development indicators that we are watching, the one thing we have been talking a great deal about, and I want to spend a minute to give you some sense of what are we saying when we say Atmanirbharta. We are old enough to remember pre-91. So it doesn't mean insularity. It does not mean autarky. It doesn't mean closed economy. We have suffered a lot on account of being autarkic or closed. So we are globalizing. In fact, after China, we are the second largest beneficiary of globalization. We have benefited a lot. So we're not against globalization, but there are some sectors of the economy where we do aspire to be self-reliant. And after the pandemic, that sentiment started to galvanize, mobilize further. Why? Because China denied us APIs. We are the largest producers of vaccines in the world, but generally most generic drugs. But pharmacy, when we are called the pharmacy to the world, it's on account of the fact that 70% of vaccines are produced in India, right? But for the production of all of this, we need the APIs, which come from outside. So when China denied us APIs, and there were certain other kind of strategic inputs, which different countries began to deny, that's when you realize that we have to have some degree of clarity on certain sectors where we cannot be over-reliant on one or more external, right, countries. So Atmanirbharta or self-reliance therefore has to be defined. First, food. We have to be self-sufficient when it comes to food. It doesn't mean self-sufficiency in all forms of food. As you can see the data here, there's something called food production index. Of the, let's say, 100 units that you consume, how much is produced within the country? The number today is 123. 50 years back it was 23. So we are producing much more than we are consuming today. A large part of it is, of course, driven by cereal production. We have a lot of food grains, right? We have a lot more. So in terms of food grain, the real challenge in terms of policy is not production, it is distribution, right? But in terms of food and overall agriculture policy, our biggest issues are in terms of diversification or improving productivity and yield as far as oil seeds or pulses, all kinds of non-cereal or non-food grain. So self-sufficiency from food grains absolutely achieved. Look at food imports. 50 years back, 1/3 of our imports used to be food. Today, it's actually 2.6%. Will it ever be zero? No, we don't want it to be zero. Why? Because we like Swiss cheese, we like avocados from New Zealand, we like global things. India really is a very large market. You should think of it as India encompasses or includes a Germany. So there is a size scale of an economy and a population, thinks, consumes, adopts technology like an advanced, and we also have a sub-Saharan Africa which coexists with it. And that's really the way you have to understand how our fiscal and monetary policy therefore needs to be constantly fine-tuned. Energy security. You know, this has only escalated further if you look at per unit or per person, per capita energy use. As a growing economy, we are going to continue to use a lot of energy. So it's going to just escalate further. But there is something unique about India's energy consumption vis-a-vis other large economies. So we compare ourselves, let's say, with China and the US. You know, simplistic comparisons of India with Bangladesh or Vietnam, it's not appropriate because those are simpler, smaller economies. They depend on one or two sectors. Right? This is a very large, complex economy. So the real appropriate comparisons, therefore, are the US, China, perhaps Brazil in some areas. But there are very few countries that you can really compare India's growth. Energy utilization. After shale discovery, in US, 33% of their energy was imported until early 2000s. But they have reduced it to now 8%. And it's falling after shale. Look at China. Despite all this growth, it has stabilized imports around 14-15%. So only 14 or 15% of the Chinese energy is imported. Look at ours. We continue to import. More than 1/3 of our energy use is imported. So we have a high dependence on external markets when it comes to energy, which is how you have to view why we are trying to do a renewable push. Not just because that is the responsible thing to do for a fast-growing economy. We can't pollute the way the OECD guys did. That would be terribly irresponsible at a global level. So you have to go green. And by the way, green transition is expensive. It's particularly expensive for a country which has just come out of poverty. So for Germany to do a green transition or Canada to do a green transition is not as costly because they are having to give up less. You have to give up a lot. It's costly, right? So please appreciate why we want renewables, but why it also helps you understand your foreign policy today. It helps you understand why we need energy. We need affordable energy. The one other strategic thing where we are having a major rethink is industrialization. Why? We have depended on agriculture for a long time, and we have had an engine of growth which has come in the form of the service sector. But that actually did confuse a lot of our policymakers into believing that India will be a unique model where we will transition from agriculture to services by completely foregoing manufacturing. You've heard this. When I moved to Delhi 10 years back, it was very common to hear that India has missed the manufacturing bus. And the sense was, why should we produce anything? After all, China is producing it and we can buy it for cheap. So let's focus on services. We still have experts come and lecture us and tell us, focus on services. Do services. Services is how you're going to grow. Forget industry. But it's very important to learn from history and learn from other countries. Every country in the world today has what is called industrial policy, which is really a euphemistic term for saying they want to manufacture in their country. They want those jobs back. Manufacturing is never about cheap goods. It's about livelihoods. And you're seeing country after country, particularly the democratic countries, because there we know what's happening. There is a major push. There is a political upheaval on the back of all these jobs going abroad. So yes, citizens have got cheap products for 20 years, but at what cost? At a loss of livelihood. And as economists, I must say, most of us have been extremely lazy, because we say, retrain people. You've been building cars all your life. Now that those jobs have gone abroad, why don't you start coding? Reskill, retrain. It doesn't quite happen like that. And in democracies, there is a pushback. That is why you're seeing a major resurgence in Western Europe and the US against globalization. And you're seeing a lot of the alternate sort of right wing emerge on account of that. The reality is also that no country will be able to do what China did, because that just was a very, let's say, unique situation which got created on account of countries coming together for myopic interest, and it has worked in favor of China, such that countries are just not going to allow easy industrialization anymore. Most late industrializing countries, by the way, Japan, Germany fall into that category, have faced a lot of resistance from previously industrialized nations, because they get very protectionist, right? So you have to appreciate why we are bringing in some of the policies we are bringing in. In fact, the US-China trade war is leading to opening of new windows of opportunity for us, and this whole push for ease of doing business is exactly that. We do want states, we do want local laws to become business friendly. That is the kind of push which is going to lead a lot of these investments to come into India. But why do I say that we might have, we were mistaken in believing that we don't want manufacturing? Because fundamentally in the last 10 years, we have had to go 180 degrees. We are now saying, no, manufacturing is very important. Manufacturing is critical for jobs. But it's not just enough to have ease of doing business and sort of improve things from a FDI perspective, etc. Human resource. One of the biggest impediment that industry is facing today is in finding mid-managers, people who have 10 to 15 years of work ex on shop floor or actually industrial work, because we don't have those guys anymore. Almost all our young people for the last 10 years have wanted to do computer science and then consulting. Everybody wants to become a consultant. And that's not, I can't blame them. We can't blame them, because we fundamentally believe that India doesn't need industrialization. We need services. So today we have an acute shortage. In fact, there are cases of the industrial belt in Tamil Nadu. They are having to recruit mid-managers from Spain and Italy. Imagine the costs. We just don't have that. So skilling is a large part to fill that gap as well. This is the all India story, right? We are a very large, diverse, every state has its own story. We have some states which are bucking the trend. Haryana, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Sikkim, Uttarakhand. These are breakout states. They are moving much faster, but not all states. And here I will tell you the story of Punjab and why it becomes important. Punjab is the black line, okay? Now, until 18 years back, so a generation, Punjab was the richest state in the country, richest in terms of per capita. Today, it's poorer than all its neighbors. And there is a lesson there. The lesson is that, cross-subsidization, I can charge more to services and industry because I want to give free things to the farmers. Cross-subsidization is how policy works. We want to give free many subsidies into sectors like agriculture, because that's the fundamental nature of agriculture. Every country in the world gives subsidies to agriculture. So there's nothing new there. But there is an extent where we can say that there is a limit to cross-subsidization. If you're going to make it so expensive for industry to function, then in this competitive federalism structure that we have today, basically all the industry from Punjab have moved. When we were in school, our sports equipments, bicycles, knitwear, everything came from Punjab. Today nothing comes from Punjab in terms of industrial products, because they have moved. Where did they go? They went to Himachal, they went to Tamil Nadu, some of them, Haryana, Rajasthan. Industry moves, So there are limits to cross-subsidization, all right? The Punjab story then tells you something very fundamental, that for states which are heavily dependent on agriculture, You need policies because your jobs are not going to get created in agriculture is very important, but the future of jobs and the future of growth is either in diversifying agriculture or putting more and more investments into industry and services. That's where the jobs are going to come from. That's what has happened to all its neighbors, Haryana, Gujarat, if you look at Himachal Pradesh, they have all moved beyond agriculture. So that's the story, and of course Punjab being a border state means there are other kinds of concerns. This is how wealth is distributed in India. Every red dot indicates 1,000 poor households. Every yellow dot indicates 1,000 middle class households, and every green dot indicates 1,000 rich households. Just look at how wealth is distributed. And tell me, does India have a north-south divide in terms of wealth? Well, there is a divide. I can draw a line from Srinagar to Kanyakumari. The western half of the country is far more affluent than the eastern half. In fact, poverty is overwhelmingly concentrated in the eastern part of the country. Okay? So that is how policy then, and NREGA in Bihar is very different from NREGA in Gujarat. You are not going to find labor to do that kind of unskilled work. It doesn't make sense to have those kind of policies. So this is not random. This is not because the western half of our country is particularly industrious or particularly lucky. There are many things in the past that have happened. One is, most of our natural resources are concentrated on the eastern part. And during the first and the second 5-year plan, it was consciously decided that the manufacturing or the processing of this resource would happen through plants which would be set up in the western parts. So most of our early industry, heavy industries, was set up in the West. And the nature of manufacturing and industrialization is such that industrialization begets further industrialization. That's why during COVID, do you remember millions of people going back to the eastern part? Because the jobs are all in the western side. People migrate from the poorer agrarian parts of the country in the east for jobs in the west, and that includes jobs everywhere, right from Punjab to Gujarat, Rajasthan, all the way down to Tamil Nadu. Okay? Now, labor market. Unemployment is a concern at a macro level for every country. It's a political issue. We care about it a lot. But we need to now open this black box. There are two concepts in the labor market that we follow closely. One is unemployment rate, and the other is labor force participation rate. Labor force participation is people in the working age group, so 18 to 59, that are either working or they are looking for work. That's when you are part of the labor market. The peculiar thing in India is, in China for 40 years they've had labor force participation rate of around 75%. So 3/4 of the working age population is either working or actively looking for work. Vietnam, similar. Bangladesh also has 62-63% labor force participation. India has struggled because our labor force participation used to be around 50% until few years back. So half our population was neither working nor looking for work. So we have a peculiarly low labor force participation. Women, and now I'm coming to the women's side. Women are a large part of this, but not the whole. And I want you to hold that thought. We'll open this black box further. But the second concept is unemployment. Unemployment rate is people in the working age who are looking for work but not finding it. And what do you notice? That the all India unemployment rate today is around 3.5-4%. The long-term average. But states like Gujarat, 0.9, Karnataka, 1.5, Chhattisgarh, 1.9, Kerala, 12.5, Goa, very high, around 10. So what is it about some of these states, which are developed states, mind you, but very high unemployment rates, 3 times the national average? That's what you have to now try and understand. And this one gives you a little bit of a sneak peek into what is happening. Unemployment is inversely related with how business friendly the state is. So it's wealth creation which is leading to job creation. States that are growing economically are creating jobs. It's a very simple fact. And the states that stand out, Punjab, Kerala and Goa, just look at that. Low ease of doing business, high unemployment rate. We really have to become more business friendly. Now, in the labor market, we have another peculiar problem, and there's a very nice term the OECD have created called youth inactivity. The youth don't want to work. It's a global phenomenon, but in India, it is quite acute. Every state of India, look at the unemployment rate of people under 30, so 18 to 29, those are the red bars, and look at the gray bars, those are the unemployment rate of people above the age of 30. So what is happening at the age of 30 that everyone seems to start working? It's not the shortage of jobs then. You can wait now. You can wait for the ideal job. You're waiting for a job that matches your aspiration. You don't want to settle into a job anymore. But I suppose by 30, the parents are like, okay, now you better go and do something. All right? But there is something more, and that is a sinister part of it. There is something called graduate unemployment. These are all young people in this graph. The red bars are unemployment rate of young people who have graduate and above degrees. So graduate, masters, PhDs, etc. Their unemployment rate is almost 4.5 times the unemployment rate of young people who have school education and below. So people who are relatively uneducated, they're all working. And the most educated segment in our society today is very likely to be sitting at home. It's called graduate unemployment. It's common in China and India. Chinese data, we don't really have too much detail, so we look at Indian data. What do we find? Number one, along with this reality, all your industry survey is telling you the same thing, which is firms are finding it difficult to grow, not on account of inability to find financing or capital. Their biggest constraint to growth is skilled manpower. They can't find skilled people. Now, how can those two things coexist? They almost sound like orthogonal, no? They are like, it's a puzzle, that your most educated are sitting at home and your industry is not able to find, skilled people. And the solution to that puzzle is really that industry doesn't just value a degree. Industry wants an actual skill. And there is a gap between degree, which is what our educational system is giving out, and the skill that the market wants. That gap is wide, it is significant, which is why skilling today is one of the biggest impediments and one of the main missions of the administration. So you saw just 2 weeks back, overhaul of the ITI, 60,000 crore being given to overhaul the industrial technology, these institutions. We have a lot more to do in skilling, right? Big gap. The other is, and maybe Goa doesn't have too much of it, the other is that we do have, in some states of the country particularly, an unusual fascination for government jobs. So there is something that states, particularly in the northern, the poorer parts of the country, people in their 20s are taking exams after exams. They're taking exams for 5-6 years. Now the thing about skill, or what you're doing, if you do something in the market, at least the industry still values that you tried selling tea, or you tried some design work, or you did some internship. But taking exam inherently is not a skill. People are losing the most productive part of their life taking exams for government jobs. There is a fascination. So the policy then is, one, demystify government jobs. That's why we keep saying that, government jobs have to become less attractive, not in terms of salary alone. Money is one part. It's the leisure and the kind of benefits. So there is the administrative reform part that we talk about. But there is a second side of it, which is, and this is a fantastic paper that appeared in the Journal of Public Economics a few years back, with case study and data from Tamil Nadu. They froze the hiring for 4 years. And you know what people found in the data? That the population which kept taking exams and eventually not making, because obviously a very large number of people are not going to get the employment. their lifetime earnings are lower than people who never appeared for these exams. Do you see the cost that as a society and as individuals we are bearing for what this government job fascination is? So this is a peculiar, and it's a problem that it has to be prioritized. The second part, which I said, low labor force participation, women are a large part of that, yes. Female labor force participation in India declined steadily from 2004-05 to 17-18. And that story you all know very well, because we have written and written and written. What you do not know is in the last 8 years, that decline has almost entirely been recovered. Largely in rural areas. But urban area, that is the blue bar at the bottom, urban area labor force participation of women was never very high. It remains quite low. It's in fact only 25%. People say, well, that could be, the rise could be because you are including unpaid work. But now suppose we look at the data excluding unpaid work, you still find that in the last 8 years this has reversed. Labor force participation of women in rural and urban has increased steadily. Is it high enough compared to the men? No, it is not. It's still a fraction. And that takes us to the real gorilla in the room, that why is it that today we have more, by the way, we have more girls in colleges of India than boys. 52% of those are STEM graduates, meaning they're doing what is considered hard sciences and maths and so on. So what happens that while women are getting more educated than ever, when it comes to labor force participation, we are only half of the men, less than half. And that really takes you to the bigger concern, which is we are still a traditional society. Women are still expected to work at home and take care of people, children and the elderly. So if you look at the time use survey, how do you spend a day? The time use survey is very telling. It's basically telling you that women in the working age group spend 5 hours taking care of someone, children or the elderly. India has 150 million people above the age of 60. So we have an elderly population which is expanding very fast too. And all that care and the care responsibility sits on the shoulders of women in the household. Now, the good thing is that household chores, cooking, cleaning, those things, as we advance technologically and as amenities become available, so we have electrification, we have drinking water, we have LPG, gas, etc., we can save on that time. So development and economic growth and better government facilities will mean our time will get freed up for the household chores, as it did in the US in 1950s. But what about care? Care is not something you can outsource. Technologically, the advancements, care is very labor intensive. So what are we going to do there? What you're noticing in terms of low female labor force participation is that a traditional society still wants children. We want children. Even the women want children. We have yet not graduated to becoming dog parents and cat parents. And children are very labor intensive. There is no technology or fix that we can use that and go to work. So when your family system is breaking down, because now you have nuclearized families, you don't have joint or STEM, and you're urbanizing very fast. The two things put together is telling you 100% responsibility of care of children is on the shoulders of women, and working women in India have a double whammy. Do you know, as a demography, they have globally the least amount of leisure time, less than half an hour per day. Working women in India are going through a crisis. They don't have any time to themselves. It's a mental health pandemic out there. Now, what happens? Well, one is you opt not to then go out and work. That's number one. So despite all our efforts, female labor force participation remains low. But second, you are choosing to have fewer kids or maybe no kids. Your fertility rate is declining much faster than what you anticipated even 10 years back. Do you know that urban India has had below 2 replacement rate, 2.1 is the replacement. For the last 25 years, urban India has been already below that. So research on India is often, it's shocking, because the real economy in India is moving so much faster than we actually have a handle on. Imagine urban India having lower than 2.1 fertility rate for the last 25 years. And also remember, no country in the world has thrown money at this declining fertility and reversed it. It's a choice. It's a conditioning. Once you have 3 kids and you go down to 2, you go down to 1, it's difficult to go back to 3 kids. So it's okay for politicians to say have 2 kids, have 8 kids. Not happening. Why is it particularly a problem in India? Because in the rich society, they are rich. So when they have fewer kids, they open their door to migrants. So migrants are going to come and do that kind of work. Or they're coming up with different kinds of fixes. Here, we've just come out of poverty. So for us to have such low fertility, which means our working population is going to shrink and our dependent population is going to keep increasing. So how are we going to sustain and how are we going to grow? So this decline in fertility is happening too soon in India. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That's why it's a major policy concern. But there are bigger changes happening, all right? On the positive side, if you're getting more affluent. I showed you poverty number, but not just poverty. Do you know food is, for the first time ever, food is less than 50% of your spending, which means you're spending on other things. Asset ownership amongst particularly the poorer segments is increasing very rapidly. We are eating more diverse food than ever, and I'll show you some numbers. Food is now no longer a major issue. There are certain other kinds of issues. For instance, rising gutka consumption. You'll be surprised. The share of monthly per capita consumption expenditure on gutka, pan, tobacco is, in some states like Gujarat, it used to be 1 or 2% 10 years back. Today it is 16%. That's the kind of, so there are other kinds of bigger problems, but there are good things too. For instance, if you look at fresh fruits, only 63% Indians ate any kind of fresh fruits 10 years back. Today, 90%. And is it only the rich? No, all quintile groups. So the bottom 20, top 20, everybody's eating fresh fruits. Why do I talk about fresh fruits? Because unlike dried fruits or cereals and pulses, fresh fruits are perishable. It's difficult to find. Okay, it means there is the back-end logistic and the supply chain, the kind of storage facilities that has been upgraded so everybody can eat fresh fruits. What about quantity of fresh fruits? You're having more than, say, 87% increase in the amount, so kilograms. Where is the biggest increase? In the most remote parts of the country. So this is all published work. Go out and read. There are big, good things happening. Milk consumption, 34% increase. Quantity of milk, 45% increase. Eggs, fish and meat. For people who think India is becoming more vegetarian, you'll be surprised. 64% people used to consume eggs, fish and meat 12 years back. Today, it is 80%. So you've had a 25% overall increase. 36% increase amongst the poorest. Quantity also, 80% increase in the amount of eggs, fish and meat you're eating. Are you seeing where I'm going with this? Affluence, better quality of life, these are the kind of things that makes a difference on a day-to-day basis. But can you eat more of everything? No. You eat less of something, no? What are you eating less of? Cereals. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out, because remember I told you we have a lot of cereals? On an average, Indians per capita consumption consumption in terms of kilograms, we used to consume 11 kilograms per person per month, cereals. Today, it is 9 kilograms. So you had 2 kg lesser food grains every month per person. And this is not just for the rich guys, it's happening for the poor people as well. Even poor people are consuming less food grains. That's what better quality of life means. You're eating more of other things. I'm also taking you towards why we have free food grains for 60% of the population. Do you see seasonality? 12 years back, you consumed fresh fruits and vegetables in the months that they were available. So look at it. In summer you had lychees and mangoes, etc. So people ate some kind of fresh fruit. In the winters you ate very little. You had some veggies, yes, but very little fresh fruits. Today, 90% and above. Throughout the year, people are consuming. So seasonality, which is an inbuilt factor into quality of life, seasonality is no longer an issue. We are consuming all food items round the year. All right? Seasonality is a very big thing. It's basically telling you supply chain improvements. We can store and it is available. Takes me to the big issue of why are we giving free food grains to 80 crore people. People have often asked me, if things are improving so much, Shamika, why are we giving so much free food grain? The simple answer, because we have a lot of free food grains. We have a lot of food grains. Your minimum support price is fundamentally based on rice and wheat. So the government procures a lot of food grains. In fact, it is more costly to store it, just give it away. It's easier. That's number one. But the economics of it, the government has effectively fiscalized the food plate, meaning the government is paying for the cereals, you pay for other things. That's why you're consuming more of everything. That's what fiscalization means. The savings from the cereal is getting channeled to all these other. Now, that's from the consumption side. The agriculture policy now is telling you people are eating less cereals. You better start producing more fruits, eggs, fish and meat, milk. Those are the things people are consuming, pulses. But the good news is that despite farm law agitation, some this, that, and the politics, Indian agriculture sector is diversifying very rapidly. You know, the fastest growing segment in agriculture today, fisheries. Andhra, Odisha, these are rock stars. Bihar, MP, none of them are doing cereals. They're all doing all these other things, right? So agricultural production in India is already beginning to respond to consumers. Now the point is, how does the government fine-tune its role? So what should it procure despite agitation and other things from different cultivators? People are eating more diverse food. This is just to tell you diversity. Everything, these are metrics of diversity. Very quickly, why is all of this important? Because I'm also concerned about diet and deficiencies. India has very high rates of anemia, which means shortage of iron. Now, where does an Indian get her iron from? A Malayali gets 40% of iron from fresh fruits, only 22% from cereals, while a person in UP gets 70% of iron from cereals and 14% from vegetables. But a person in Rajasthan, 84% iron comes from cereals. So almost all iron for a Rajasthani is coming from cereals. You know why we fortify rice? Fortification of rice is one of the ways in which we are trying to take iron, because iron deficiency is very high. But what is the data now telling you? That as people are consuming diverse food items, anemia is falling. In fact, it's falling much faster than the fortification efforts of the government. So just diverse food items, when you get iron from 4 or 5 different sources, it's much better than taking an iron capsule or the fortified rice of the government. And all biologists and doctors will tell you the same, because the iron in fortified rice is not as soluble. But the iron from fresh fruits and all of these other things, it's good for you. So you see, fiscalized food plate, by giving free food grains, people are eating more of all of these things. And all of those things, not just in terms of consumption, your micronutrient deficiency in 11 micronutrients has improved. That is what the widespread changes are. I'll quickly move to, okay, this is just asset ownership. Asset ownership, this is the poorest 20% in India, poorest. Only 4% of them owned some automobile, mostly a bike or a scooter, but occasional jeep or a small car. Today, you know what that number is? It's 40%. So 40% of the poorest 20% Indians own a motorized vehicle. Why is this? Why am I telling you this? Because this is not being given as a freebie by any state government or a political party. You have to pay for these things. And this is a lump sum payment, which means there is a down payment and there's also banking facility because these are mostly financed. These are indicators which you don't see when you look at a few macro indicators like fiscal deficit, inflation, which is what most economists focus on. So people's understanding of economics or the Indian economy therefore remains limited to a few metrics. But this is what Indian real economy is, right? Big changes. And I'm going to end. This is my last story. We are living in the age and time of what is called narrative economics. This is a book by Robert Shiller. He's a Nobel awardee. What is narrative economics? That who owns the story? This used to be largely in the area of corporate finance. That, 30, 40 years back, companies used to plant story about their rivals. That, he had a heart attack. Oh, there are divorce proceedings. You plant story because it affects the stock price. So you plant bad stories about your rivals and you plant good stories about yourself. Because stories affect valuation and business and economy. Unfortunately, what used to be confined to the area of corporate finance is today's lived reality of geoeconomics. And I'm going to tell you this small story. This is a paper I wrote for Brookings 5 years back. This graph is telling you, this is data from all the media in the world. This is hundreds of millions of data points. It's in more than 100 languages. If it is on Google, it is here. Okay? That's how large this data is. And you can use natural language processing by stringing some words together and get what is called sentiment analysis. You know whether this is a positive news or a negative news, and just how positive or how negative. It's called tone of the media. So how does the global media cover different countries? And this is the period of the pandemic. So the world in this analysis begins in the spring of 2020 at the beginning of COVID outbreak. Do you see, and the countries that I'm going to look at are China, Sweden, India, US, and Germany. Why Sweden? Because that was the only country which did not have a lockdown. They experimented by saying, well, let there be herd immunity right away. Okay. In the beginning, do you see that all countries are getting negative news coverage globally? It falls anywhere between -1.5 and -2.5. And that is normal, because the whole job of media is to tell problems. No? The whole reason why media is important is because it highlights problems. So of course negative news. But what happens within 6 months of the pandemic? What happens in 6 months? That the democracies of the world continue to get negative coverage. By the way, do you see that big purple decline? That is Donald Trump's re-election campaign. The whole world was talking negatively about the US. What a crazy democracy. What a crazy campaign. That's why that purple, that is Donald Trump. Do you see what happens within 6 months? The democracies continue to be in the bandwidth of -1.5 to -2.5. Negative coverage. What happens to the global coverage on China? It doesn't just pull away from the others. On an average, it's positive. Which means, globally, everyone's saying good things about China. Is this normal? Well, it would be normal if this were only the Chinese media that the Chinese government can censor. This is not Chinese media. This is global media. This is media in Ecuador. This is media in New Zealand, in India. Why is everyone saying good things about China? Because it is a campaign. This is narrative economics. Media house after media house is basically being bought out. There is a lot of money flowing. This is a narrative campaign unfolding from Beijing. Now there is ample evidence. But this is COVID pandemic. Why do I say this is what is happening? Because I also know the source of the news. You see how beautiful data can be. This tells you the source, whether the source is domestic media of the country, whether it is foreign media, so outside the country. And what do you observe? That the most negative news on India, do you see the black line at the bottom? that's the most negative, no? It's all below 2.5, terrible news, is coming from sources that are unknown. You don't know, dark web. Which also happens to be the source for the most positive news on China. You see the yellow line on top? That's also unknown. These are not media houses that you and I know of. These are unknown. That's how you have to use data today to parse out what in some ways has become the challenge for many democracies. Open democracy, free press, it's going to get you this. Now, the idea is not to clamp down. You need media. You need coverage. But if there is indeed a narrative campaign which is unfolding, all it is telling you is that democracies of the world will have to have a counter strategy. We will have to have ways and means of protecting our institutions which are constantly going to be under attack. All right? So economy today is no longer a simple view of the economy. It's far more complex, and there are many forces beyond control, but the knowledge of it at least helps you design policies to counter it to some measure, but also have your own counter narratives, right? So I will end on that. Thank you very much.
Share this private joke. I casually told Shamika I need to have some water now and then take the questions. So let's give it a minute or so of pause and then questions.
I am B.S. Patil. I am a professor of law. You made a mention about agriculture. I'm interested in knowing the government's policy on, because I think we are on the verge of another land reforms. And what would be the strategy? Are you going to corporatize agriculture also? So what is the takeaway? Thank you.
Uranium would be an imported source of energy, whereas thorium is abundantly available in India. So I don't know where this story will start or end, because thorium was thorium reactors were planned by our scientists Abdul Kalam and Anil Kakodkar, but subsequently we hear nothing about them, and even the nuclear deal which was signed, there's nothing about it till now. So how are we going to reach energy security and reduce our import bills if we are not looking at thorium?
To the energy security question, you know, in this budget there was an announcement on the small and medium reactors. The small and medium reactors, you're going to see a fair amount of movement on that front. There's already a lot of interest. I'm not entirely sure on the first part of your question, but I do know that Niti Ayog's Dr. Saraswat did come up with a paper which looked at these, the different strategies as far as non-nuclear renewable was concerned, right? So do take a look at that. On corporatized land, I'm not, corporatized, these are all politically charged phrases. It means nothing to an economist. You must understand one thing. Agriculture, a lot of things depends on the state government. That's why many aspects of the agricultural law, the Farm Act, it didn't go through at a central level, but most states have already implemented many different aspects of it. Because even when we had these raging protests, 86% of farmers in this country wanted those laws to be passed. So in some ways what happens is that you're always at the mercy of well-organized, well-mobilized minority. And in this case it happened to be farmers of 2 states, that to 1 state, right? So I think, that's the beauty of a large federal system. All it tells me is that it's going to take that much longer for Punjab to course correct. Other states they've moved on, right? Which is why I mentioned fruits and fisheries, etc. I mean, other states are moving on because they are responding to not just global demands, but also changing nature of domestic demand and the willingness to pay. Right? And you want to be careful. You want government, but you don't want government in everything. Yeah.
Employed professional. My confusion rather was regarding female low labor force participation rate. So what is the government's policy? Is it trying to improve this rate? But then probably that would, what we're talking about, the fertility issue that we have, that we are having lesser and lesser children. But the more female participation will result in lower fertility rate. So what is the golden thing that we have to achieve? What is the government's policy? And without killing the aspirations of young girls, how will you, I mean, what is the policy that is required and what is it that government is trying to do? Because the unpaid work is not valued, I think, and that is why girls are moving into this. Or is the government encouraging female participation? Then you cannot expect the increasing fertility rate. So that was my question.
It's the most difficult part of this whole talk. It's the most difficult conversation also for a woman to have. And I'll tell you why. Because when I go back to my own college, I graduated from LSR and DO, and I go back and these are girls who have got 100%. That's how they got admission, and I'm trying to tell them it's okay to have children. But by the way, your family won't help you. And you know, I mean, even corporations, how many of them really have daycare and other? The reality of today is we are not prepared for it. That's number one. But the real answer to your question, Vaishali, is that who am I to profess what is the ideal? Everybody will have to decide. But I think the policy's effort has to be to make enough investments in care infrastructure so that the girls are able to, young women are making an actual choice. A happy choice. Today when they are choosing not to go to work because there's a child, and it's not a choice. It's basically forced because I still wanted the kid. Maybe I regret it later because everybody told me have a kid and I'll help you, and nobody's there. That's the reality. But the reason I'm saying this is difficult, and it requires a little bit of introspection for us as a society. You know, during COVID, in the Western, particularly countries like Belgium or Western Europe, this is the first time in human history that so many elderly people have died alone, without a kin, a family member around. We cannot or we shouldn't try and ape the growth path of the OECD nations. Japan did. China did. Well, China did much more than ape, right? It's coercively they insisted on one child. And now the government is giving time off, the government is paying, they're sending people home, can we see your fertility test? No country, like I told you, has managed to reverse fertility decline. So it's not about resource alone, right? That window of opportunity, once it shrinks, it's very difficult to convince young couples to then going back to having more kids. Never happened.
Right? Should we work so much towards female low labor force participation rate? It's good that it is low.
No, all I'm trying to tell you is, you know, when we have multilateral institutions, the World Bank, UN, when they come and lecture us that increase your female labor force participation, this is a shameful part of it. Number one, it's not low anymore. There's been a 69% increase in rural areas. So first of all, my job is to educate them and everyone else that your data is telling you that decline has all been reversed, but only in rural areas. In rural areas, they are working and they're having children. But that's because the families are there. They are joint families, or there are uncles or aunts, so there's some stem structure where the woman has help. In urban areas, the increase is not, it's a little bit, no, but it's nothing. And that's because this is particularly a problem in urban India.
May I proceed with my second question, or somebody else needs?
I will leave that too.
My name is Ketki, I'm a mental health expert. My question is, being a mental health expert, I've seen in Goa as well, still we have a mental health taboo. You know, people are not open-minded still to talk about it. And at a national level, what are the measures have been taken regarding awareness on mental health? Because being in mental health board also, we have seen patients coming for treatments, and once they get discharged, a lot of family members do not positively accept them because still society has a big taboo of mental health. So I think at a national level, it's high time, as you spoke about a mental health pandemic, which we all aware about, and there is a rise in mental health cases as well. So what at a national level we need to do so that people are comfortable talking about mental health?
Ketuki, that is such an important question. One that I think it's something we all understand, perhaps don't appreciate as much. And this, now it's going to get personal. I have two sons. My oldest son is autistic. And so when I talked about care, I only talked about children and elderly. I did not talk about disabilities. That requires an entire, and by the way, if you look at Indian data, we have a paper in Journal of Autism. We have 1 in 56. We underreport, but the incidence is there. We do have laws, Ketaki, and I personally have been trying and pushing a lot of it. We have laws, but even if you look at the recent 2016 law for person with disabilities, the law is very nice, as most law. Well, no, in India many laws can be obnoxious, but that law is particularly good. But the ratification has not happened in most states of the country, right? Which means in response to what the needs are, and this is not even mental health, this is, right, something that you openly see and whatever, but there is a shortage. And on mental health, let me give you another very dismal statistics. We talk about farmer suicides, because farmers are a very well mobilized political group. You know, the highest suicide mortality rate, which means 25% of all your suicides, 25%, are housewives. And it's not now, it has been for the last 40 years. Who talks about it? Because they're not mobilized enough, they're not politically, right? The point is, it affects the household, it affects the children, it affects productivity, it affects everything, right? We did bring in the mental health mission from NIM hands, but I'll tell you, the shortage of caregivers, particularly specialists, is so acute that we are still depending much more on distance and telemedicine and online counseling, etc. So it's still very, very minimal, I think. But as a society, change will only happen if we show and talk and right, demand more. It's also a public health problem, which means, again, once the laws are there, making sure that the rules are notified, and once the rules are notified, the problem also doesn't end there, because many places where the notification has also happened, parents don't know, the children don't know, the schools don't know or don't care. But I think that is where civil society, I think civil society over the last many years, we have discounted the real role and the weight that civil society can bring in transforming and keeping up with this rapid change that this society is undergoing. I'll combine Ketaki and Vaishali's question to say one thing. We don't want to ape the West, but we must also define then that what is India's growth and development going to be with our value system. If we want to value women in the household, then we also, it's like saying, and I was having a conversation before, it's the way we measure GDP. It's like saying, if Madhavi, your wife, suppose Madhavi came to my house and took care of my child, and I go to Pushkar's house and take care of Pushkar's daughter, then the GDP doubles. Because it is marketed transaction. There is money. When the care is in the household, there's no money transacted, it's not a marketable exercise, so it's not part of the GDP. But the value is there, right? And that's when I say that we need to have India's development and growth with Indian characteristic. We will have to not just measure, but actively put a value. We must insist that a woman who is working in the house is of great value, so a young person can choose to raise healthy kids and have a good family, and that is just as valuable to a society and a nation as a woman who then goes and chooses to work outside. But right now that is not the case. Not only does the family discount all the work, but the society does it as well. And again, that requires for scholars and society and for us to say, well, this is how we are going to be different from the Western nation. We don't want to die alone. I think we must articulate this repeatedly and teach the kids and the young ones and so on.
My name is Tejas. India is doing a lot of free trade agreements. India has a free trade agreement with Thailand, Indo-Thai agreement, and also has an India-ASEAN agreement, which is a regional trade agreement. So when country-to-country trade agreement and a regional trade agreement, does it mean that the regional trade agreement will get superseded? This is the first part. And the second part is Viksit Bharat 2047. Like all the developed countries have low single-digit banking interest rates.
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that.
The developed countries have low single-digit banking interest rates, whereas India has higher single-digit banking interest rates. So in 2047, what is the trend or the trajectory of the banking interest rates, and what will be the connection with the importance to physical gold that families have in India? Thank you.
Okay. So in RCEP, one of the reasons we did not get into a regional sort of a trade agreement is because we have bilateral trade agreements with almost all ASEAN countries. And what we basically just preempted this big crisis we have right now, where almost all multilateral institutions, including multinational and multi-country, these kind of agreements are all under crisis. Number one, because a lot of these regional ones in our region is getting overwhelmed by Chinese. So we're trying to insulate ourselves from that influence. There's a lot of dumping which is happening. By the way, if you just look at Trump's policies and how he's responding to many countries, one of the reasons why Vietnam is getting beaten down, despite Vietnam having a trade agreement with the US, is because the Chinese are routing a lot of their exports through Vietnam and Mexico and so on. So I'll tell you, it's a bit of a crazy world right now, and what is our best effort is to do bilateral. Right, so we're moving in that direction. Many other countries are also going in that direction. On interest rate, I'll tell you the biggest takeaway right now is, do you see that food is now a very small part of your consumption? It's not like before. But the weightage even till date, the way we measure what do we look into CPI basket? When we are looking at CPI, because inflation has to be taken care of, that's why interest rate, in that basket we give 55% weightage to food. That's why when tomato or onions or something rises, everybody says, oh, interest rate will not come down, inflation is rising. But you see, as society becomes more affluent, and food becomes a smaller segment, it has to get reflected in our macro policy also, right? So the way we are measuring interest rate is fundamentally going to undergo a change. It is undergoing a change. And you have seen the recent big cuts. It's on account of the fact that interest rate now, inflation is no longer as much is not a concern. If it does, it's a variable you can work with. So in the long run, that's why developed large markets like US have much lower, because their inflation, despite COVID, now they have managed to bring it. Gold, we love gold. And one of the reasons we love gold is, first, it's with me, it's physical asset. It is not affected by the uncertainties of the financial sector. All I'm saying is, it's an indicator of financial sector uncertainties, and the more globalized you are, global turmoil can affect your financial savings and your means. Gold is insulated from that. So many traditional countries, gold is therefore very important. So it is likely to remain. We are trying many things to monetize, but nothing comes close. People love their gold.
From DMC College, Mapsa. I just wanted to bring one observation. It is not a question, it is an observation, that you said that skill is what is needed for the hour. But the implementation of NEP has covered that. So that is one good progress what the government has taken. My question is that you were saying that the development in either it is food or it is whatever the fruits what they are having from 2011 now, the progression is there and India is developing. But the media, what you said last, second last slide, that the unknown media, how to curtail? Because if you see, India is doing very well, but the media shows the negative impact of what India is, and they're bringing it down. So how we can curtail that kind of media? Because when the progressing country like China, it is all positive, but whereas India is negative. How to bring that gap? That is my question.
The new education policy, Professor Shanti, is really a framework for doing many things. Skilling is one part of it, but I think the beauty of NEP is that as a framework, it is allowing institutions to experiment. 21st century knowledge, future ready, these completely new ideas. I mean, right now, educational institutions, even the best of universities in the world, are trying to understand how to incorporate machine learning or AI, adaptive AI, chat GPT, all of this into their curriculum. Because children have access to everything, students have access to everything. NEP is allowing for many experiments, right? One of that, but over and beside that, we also have an entire new ministry for skilling. Please appreciate how important this skill gap is. Because growth of a nation requires people with actual skills. You should know how to build the table, you should know how to fix the phone, computer, the electric. And even when I studied in Kendriya Vidyalaya in Kerala, we used to have SUPW and all these kind of, we did something. Right, sewing we learned. Gradually, I think skill has been degraded or completely eroded from the curriculum, which is why everybody wants to sound smart and they want to know things, but they don't know how to do things. Country can't grow on the back of everybody being very smart but not being able to do. That's why we are very good in the sectors that we are. Again, if you look at any of our major space program, almost all those scientists, they're not IITians, they're second level tier, whatever, IITians, the way we treat IITians as global, a lot of them are going into consulting and services, right? In some sectors we are doing well, like space, that's the reason I'm saying that. But when it comes to core industry, big gap. That's why skill ministry is an entirely new ministry being created by giving this whole job that not only education, but internship, apprenticeship. We're trying to learn from Germany. We're sending people to Japan. We're sending now to Taiwan. We're sending them wherever they can learn certain things. Some are, of course, very sector specific. But our children, I mean, we must know how to do and build things. On the narrative, we are a democracy. There are many things we will not do because we are not an authoritarian country. Now, by the way, please do not be under any illusion that China has its economy under control. They don't. And why is it that the Chinese are having such, in fact, they're having a structural decline now? Why? One of the reasons is because they have a very repressed local demand. Right? One of the strengths we have, but I don't want it to be like, oh, because we only want to look at domestic, let's not. That's not the idea. But your domestic demand is like a strategic asset. So far, it has given you a buffer to almost all global turmoil because India is growing on the back of domestic demand, domestic financing, domestic savings. Right? So, yes, they have the narrative under control, but I think democracies, you see all democracies, it's not just us. But I think India is particularly vulnerable because we are not yet like a US or any of these G7 which has the technology or it has big tech firms under control of governments and policies where we truly are an open democracy. All it is we have to have empowered citizenship. We have to write more, we have to talk more, we have to show more research, right? And I think democracy has its inherent weaknesses, but I think in the long run, it's standing, I mean, it stood us well, and it's likely to continue to stand us well. That's why, by the way, when I started with poverty eradication, it's everywhere. You cannot win elections, you cannot live in a democracy by neglecting or only favoring some and at the. So no, there are good things, there are problems, but there are lots of good things. On the intelligence side, there is work being done. I have given you a very small snapshot of what is actually happening. So the intelligence agencies, they all know far more than this. That is also the modern warfare, cyber security. You have excellent articles written on North Korea's revenue model around cyber threats and all kinds of ransomware, right? There's a revenue model. There's a whole unit which raises money by basically attacking different sites and institutions and stealing data. That is the reality we are in. So that is how we are improving our institutions to counter that.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Shreyas Desai. I really liked your insights about how other food grains, free food grains, are creating many positive side effects. One of the observations that I have is that here in Goa, especially towards the rural side, what is happening is, in addition to the free food grains, people are also given a lot of direct benefit transfer schemes. And this is causing sort of unwillingness on part of the people to do any kind of jobs, especially agricultural jobs. People who would come to farms and work there are no more willing to work there. They are, or even if they come, they ask for very high charges, and they are not very sincere in their work. So that is, I would like to know your views about that. And second question that I have is demographic dividend that we are talking about. India is also slowly transitioning towards an aging society. Or replacement fertility rate is already less than 2 now. So is it going towards demographic disaster, or I would like to know your views about that also. Thank you, ma'am.
I think the problem with the, I'll tell you why DBT exists, and then I'll tell you the problem is that if it becomes an electoral tool, every party is promising in the manifesto a new DBT, then it's a race to the bottom. And I haven't shown you numbers. I encourage you to download a very comprehensive report I had published 2 years back on the state of the state budgets, right? And in the long term, how they are looking. There are states where the fiscal discipline is now highly questionable. Their interest burden is very high, as a result of which they don't have enough money to spend on development, whether social or economic, but there's very little money. The other side is there are states which are not able to generate revenues. And this is where a large part of the northeastern states will come in, that their fiscal remains fragile because they're largely dependent on grants from the center. But states in the long term have to generate revenue, which means that there are taxable activities in that state. That's how the state gets the revenue to spend on everything. Then there are states which are highly dependent on agriculture, and agriculture is not taxed. So then their revenue is also fragile, and therefore they have to depend on. So read that report to get a sense on different states in India, what is the status as far as fiscal deficit. But the DBT is telling you, DBT is required, number one, because universally, and this is something you have to understand, economists have agreed on very few development instruments. DBT happens to be one of them, the direct cash transfer or benefit transfer. The reason most economists agree that this is the best way to help a development cause is because there's no middleman. The leakage is not, the money goes directly into the account. And when that happens, you're going to use it for your own good, and you know better than anybody else what is good for you. That is the larger logic. So DBT or cash transfer is globally very popular in emerging markets and developing markets. DBT in India started out like that. That we are now saving 1.5% of our GDP. Because earlier, we used to spend 3 rupees so that 1 rupee of benefit could go to a person. That is the level of inefficiency we were working on. But because everybody has Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, mobile, it's a direct transfer. In fact, the IMF called DBT a logistic marvel. Because seemingly, in fact, 2017, I had written an article in Foreign Affairs that maybe we should go towards UBI or something. Now I said no. Because then my point was, if there are going to be so many leakages, might as well give cash. But the universal nature of it, we don't have to do that anymore because we can target very well. You have Aadhaar, you have bank account, you have telephone, etc. Right? So that is the reason DBT is so popular in the States. Now it becoming an electoral tool will require us to say, when is it a freebie which is causing distortion and when is it needed? And I'll tell you when is it needed. In states where I showed you the maternal mortality being high, neonatal, etc., there are states where the health outcomes are not good. Those also happen to be the states where the state capacity to deliver primary health care or, take-home ration, the quality of is not very good. So if the state capacity doesn't exist, then we are saying, should we wait for the state capacity to rise for us to then make this benefit reach the people? We're saying, cut it out, direct de do. You see the appeal. So it's a chicken and egg. Yes, the capacity of the state must improve in health and education particularly, and nutrition. But as citizens, we are saying, how long do if you're not going to get good at it, people shouldn't suffer, so DBT. The risk is becoming an electoral tool. So now what I'm trying to estimate is how large is a DBT in a given state. The question you asked, that people are not willing to work because now, they're getting all this free, so why work? Which means effectively your real wages have increased too much. I will work only when you pay me above a certain level. And here we must have an honest conversation as Indians. We are the only country where a minimum law legislation was brought in before we actually grew economically. In Japan, they had 100 years of economic growth before they brought in a minimum wage legislation. So you have basically, it's because we want good things. We want everybody to have everything. Maternity leave, 3 months, why 3 months, 6 months kar do? So these are nice sounding progressive ideas. What you don't realize is that can you afford these progressive ideas at this stage of per capita income? Right? So that's a balance which then politically you have to decide. Some parties want to do one thing, some parties the other. But at least we must measure how bad are things. And here we have data on NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee. When we did an analysis in 2010, we said that NREGA had a direct impact on poverty reduction, which is great and as expected. But then subsequent papers that I did, where I was looking at enterprise development, there we saw that because NREGA raised the rural wages so much, nobody is willing to work below this. Effectively, it has made cost of doing any business which hires labor higher. So many micro enterprises had to shut down. Now, my job as an economist is to tell the policymaker and people that then the cost of NREGA is not just the rupee that you are spending on NREGA. The cost is also 100,000 micro enterprises shut down. That is the real cost. So that is the difference between thinking like an accountant where money is spent and thinking like an economist where future money is also gone. So you're giving up on future growth for poverty reduction today. That is what we have done, and in DBT that might be a real fear. So we have to measure therefore. Sorry for that very long, windy answer.
Okay, that leaves time for one. Sorry, it's sort of, okay, last. Amitabh Tripathi Rahul and the gentleman at the back. The third question, the third hand I can see there. Please, could you just come at the end and ask your question? Okay.
Yeah, I'm Rahul Tripathi. I teach political science at Goa University, and I was really glad at the number of time you used the word politics in your presentation. Coming from a member of the Economic Advisory Council, I mean, if we had listened to a similar lecture in the 90s, it would have been full of data, statistics, figures, but I think you set the tone. My question would be on the specific issue of labor laws. And I think that is one gray area which perhaps the government is still to come out, kind of a balanced picture with regard to the labor codes. That is intricately also linked to, therefore, manufacturing. So how do you see progress as far as the labor laws are concerned in context of manufacturing and other
You know, labor laws, if you remember the 4 codes, that amendment has happened. You see, in a large federal system, almost all your factor markets, whether it is land, labor, these are all, eventually they have to be notified by state governments. And there, that is where the cookie crumbles. That it's one thing for the parliament to enact, it's one thing for the central government to reform. The other is for the state to actually ratify, then notify, and then implement. And that is where I think partly it is politics, partly it is lack of political entrepreneurship, I think, at the state level. But again, let me tell you, sometimes we put very high a wager, we want all states. The states that are doing it are actually gaining tremendously. And therein lies the India story. That there are states that are industrializing very fast because they are reforming their labor laws. There are states that actually gain much more every time we enter a trade agreement because they are the ones prepared to take advantage of that, not the ones who protest. And that's, I mean, what do you get in a large federal system? You have political entrepreneurs at states, chief ministers who are like chief executives today, who are trying to woo investors and raise FDIs and so on. And I think that is where the big changes are likely to come from. But I think, there are, in the last 10 years, your unification of taxes, right? GST, it's huge. We don't realize it's huge. Banking system, China is still struggling with its banking system. The US went through a turmoil on account of subprime mortgage. India has cleaned up all its bank. Right? Infrastructure, major investments and major efficiency gain. Productivity in infrastructure has risen, and all, not just roads, but ports. Your ports have become, in fact, even The Economist has run special editions saying how Indian ports are becoming much, much better. Right? There are many things that are being done, but eventually for businesses to grow and for that industrialization to happen or for new businesses to merge, one segment is the whole startup space, which we didn't speak about. So every time you get a little despondent, kya labor laws nahi ho raha, big industry no ye wo. You go to any business school today or any technology institution. Hamare time mein the cool kids would play guitars and today the cool kids have startups. They are a part of an incubator, they are raising the money, they are growing. And therein lies, I think, the change will happen from there. We can't wait for consensus on many of these things. So that is the India story. Jahan pe ho raha hai, bahut ho raha hai, 6.5%, 7% is for such a long, all 3 decades is fantastic.
I'm Manush Ghosh from Kolkata. My question is very simple and straight. While Government of India has focused a lot on all-round development of Bimaru states, and it has shown results and it has been pursuing those policies with great seriousness and dedication, I don't see the same. We in Eastern India and Northeastern India, we don't see it, doing the same so far as 7 sisters are concerned. Northeastern states are concerned, which is encouraging forces inimical to India in India's neighborhood to cast evil eyes on the Northeastern, on the 7 sisters. I want a straight answer from you, ma'am.
The straight answer is that the Northeast is growing unlike ever before. And this is not just the GDP numbers measured through surveys. Your satellite imagery, and I recommend that you download the satellite paper which we put out last year before the elections. If you look at satellite image, which is not survey data, so there could be human error in what you report. Satellite is telling you how much actual surface area built up is there. One of the fastest growth, Northeast. So Northeast is developing largely on the back of major infrastructure push, right? And big gains are happening not in 1 or 2 states but across. Largely, of course, pushed through Assam, but they're growing. Now, the security threat, Mr. Ghosh, you're talking about, You have to think of, this belief that it's underdevelopment which leads to insurgency. It is underdevelopment which leads to security problems. It is underdevelopment that leads to terrorism. Nothing further from the truth. You have to recognize that you're in a very hostile neighborhood. Your neighbors are actively arming and pushing separatists and infiltrators. It's about time we actually had an honest conversation. For a long time, for Kashmir also, we kept saying the same. People are suffering because they don't have jobs. That's why they take the guns. Nothing further from the truth. India spends far more in Jammu Kashmir than it does in most states. And similar for Northeast. Right? So I think it's about time. And again, I want you to download that state budget. There is an entire segment on Northeast. And what now I am arguing that it's been 20 years, 25 years, that 10% of India's development, central schemes, development budget goes to the Northeast in the form of grants. Or 10%, all development. 25 years. Now it's about time we actually evaluate what are the revenue models of our states. Sikkim is doing very well. So let's not paint all of them the same. Sikkim is almost twice the per capita GDP of Bhutan, by the way. Many of you think Bhutan is a fantastic place. I just visited, I loved it. But Sikkim is twice as rich as Bhutan. But Sikkim is Sikkim. Not all states, they have differences. So we have to be, every state has a peculiar issue. And it's not linked to underdevelopment alone. Everything in every state can be linked to some kind of underdevelopment, but not anymore. Right? So take a look at the satellite image data and take a look at the state budget to understand what is happening to revenue and state fiscal. And don't link it to security and infiltration and separatist movements. Because that assumes that everything else in economics we call ceteris paribus. Or baki sab changa si. That's not true. Your neighborhood is not. The whole drug problem in the Golden Triangle, right? That is where a lot of drugs come from. In fact, there's a lot of literature from Brookings. There's a senior fellow. She has done phenomenal work on the kind of drug routes through India and what is it doing to both our eastern and western. On the east from Burma and so Myanmar, China, Laos, and on the west from Afghanistan, Pakistan. Read up. Economics is not just about one or two sectors. It's everything.
I think Shamika deserves a break. अंत में आकर we'll just wrap it up because otherwise we can go on for quite some time. If I look at the number of hands going up, and she had a meeting earlier before she came here, and then there was a press interview around 5, and the talk. So let's be kind. Shamika, thank you so much again for coming to ICG and for such a thorough talk and so patiently answering all the questions. And I see that you're willing to go for more, but I think we really should stop. And thank you all for coming because, we're not sure what the weather would be like at this time of the year, but thankfully it cleared up a little bit and it was wonderful to have you here with us. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for that.